Hey everyone. Okay, today is the last lecture for CAS 204, Communication Research Methods. After today, we are into our final quant work presentation stuff, so it's a lot of data collection and math and preparation on your part. This should be rather short and sweet. There's just a couple of final ideas I want to get across to you, and then you are welcome to start working on exam 4, which is sort of the quant stuff, and the final exam, which is going to be comprehensive for the whole semester. So yeah, you're welcome to start working on those after you get through this discussion. All right, so the final chapter of this book sort of starts with this TSLA quote, which is pretty well known, but I'll go ahead and read through it and kind of unpack it a little bit for you. But what T.S. Eliot says is that we shall not cease from our exploration, and at the end of all our exploring, we will be to arrive where we started and know that place for the first time. All right. So what T.S. Eliot is saying is that, look, when you go out and you explore a subject, at the end of all of it, you sort of come back to the beginning and you are seeing the phenomena with new eyes. In a sort of more, I don't know, metaphorical, lovey-dovey, kumbaya way. Think about sort of like leaving home and going to college, studying abroad, moving across the country for a job, and then coming back to your hometown years later. You all probably haven't experienced this because you're too young yet, but there is something about sort of like seeing this hometown for the first time, excuse me. And the same is true with research, right? There's phenomena that's happening all around us, and we start to sort of dig into it and we research it and we crunch numbers about it. And then we come back to it and we realize it feels like we're seeing it for the first time with all of this new information. For those who've had me for other classes, possibly CAS 203, which is interpersonal, we read The Great Gatsby. This is a book that a lot of students have read in high school. But then they read it when they're in college, and they sort of say, I experience this book differently when I'm 20 years old as opposed to when I was 15 years old. The Great Gatsby is just one of those books that I think a lot of people come back to in different phases of their life because it is one of those sort of like quintessential high school books. And when you read it when you're 14, 15 years old, you're like, what's the big deal? And then you go through some things, your personal things, right? You go through relationships and breakups and getting back together, and you move across the country and you have this angst. A lot of it has to do with people in their late 20s, early 30s is where, these are the individuals sort of in Gatsby's world. And yeah, they have all these sort of ups and downs of, post-college age kind of stuff where they're trying to figure everything out. Well, now you kind of come back when you're 35 and you read Gatsby and you're like, I just went through that. I kind of see it with new eyes. All right, so this is what T.S. Eliot is saying about research. When you go into research, you have a lot of questions with regard to things that already interest you. All right, but then once you sort of get through the research, you realize, like, even though you've had an interest in said phenomenon for 10 years, you come back to it and you're like, I'm experiencing it differently. It's new to me. For my research on homelessness, for instance, as you all had read, I'd been sort of in that world for 10 years or so as far as volunteer work and working at shelters and just sort of knowing people who were homeless. And then I did research, I did formal research on it, and by the time I got done with my dissertation, it really did feel like I knew it, but it felt differently as far as the knowledge that I was able to acquire from the individuals who were part of the participants for the study. All right, so that's what is all going on here. Go out there, explore the world. You're going to come back home. You're going to sort of have new eyes to sort of see what's going on. All right. So every time that you do research, it should be related to a theory. I'm going to explain one specific situation as a little case study for us. It is pretty relevant today, but I've been using this as a case study for 10 years or so now. But like critical race theories are just definitely like sort of starting to peak in like mainstream conversations. But it's just something that I've used for a while. What you do with research, all right? When it comes to research, you should go into it with the attitude of trying to disprove a theory or hypothesis. If you go into research trying to prove a theory, what ends up happening is you start doing what we call cherry picking data, right? So if I have a theory let's say critical race theory is the theory I'm working with. I can go out in the world and I can find examples where racial discrimination is happening, right? That's you can do that with just about any theory, right? Because the reason that you sort of conceptualize a theory in the first place is just because you see things informally happen in the world. Like, oh, I think I have a theory for this. I'm going to test it scientifically, right, with some sort of academic, rigorous, what have you. But then you just kind of go out and you just kind of you're just finding more examples to sort of prove the theory you've already sort of seen in the world. The problem with that approach is that, you can find examples for every theory out there, all right? Research should be done in a way with this attitude and this mindset of I have a theory and I want to go out there and test that theory in order to try to disprove it. And I want other people to take my theory and try to disprove my theory. When you do research with that attitude, what ends up happening is you just take a whole lot of rigorous testing and you throw it at the theory. And if the theory is still standing, even though you've tried to disprove it, you try to disprove it, you try to disprove it, and at the end this theory is still standing, you're like, that's a good theory. That theory really stands up to scrutiny. If you go in and you're like, there's a theory and I'm just going to sort of like give it more data that already supports it, the theory's not really being tested. You're sort of coddling the theory. You're like, here theory, here's some more examples that I have found. And you're not really like, you should be like punching the theory, right? You should be very aggressive with trying to disprove the theory. But unfortunately, a lot of people, they have theories. They create a theory. They're like, this is my little baby. This is my theory. And I'm just going to go find examples that kind of keep proving my theory. And then all of a sudden, like the theory doesn't stand up to scrutiny because it's never been tested in a rigorous way. All right. So don't go into research with this idea of like, I have to prove that my theory works. Go into research with saying like, I have a theory. Let me try to like knock this theory over. And if the theory is still standing, you're like, that's a really good theory. I couldn't find any examples. I couldn't find any ways to disprove this theory. And therefore the theory stands up to scrutiny, right? The other thing that you should be doing if you have a theory, right? You come up with a theory and then you want to give that theory to the world, right? So this is what academic publication is all about. It's like, I have a theory. I give that theory to the rest of the academic community. And then the academic community who doesn't, they might not like me personally. They might not like my theory. Their job now is to sort of like throw research and experiments at my theory to try to disprove my theory. And at the end of it, let's say there's 10 really hardcore, rigorous researchers who throw information and data and try to disprove my theory. And at the end of a 10-year process of everybody trying to write articles and show everybody how Josh is wrong, my theory is still standing. It's like, Josh has something here. Like there's a new discovery or way of understanding the world that Josh figured out. And for 10 years, we've been trying to disprove his theory and we can't do it. We can't do it in a sensible manner, right? That's the attitude you should have with research. Don't coddle your theories so much, or your worldview so much that you never let people critique it. People should be critiquing your theories. That's the whole point of academia, right? The point of academia is not to not go in and let's say, I have a theory, and everyone's like, oh, let's be really nice to that theory and protect it forever. No, that doesn't get us anywhere, right? Because then everybody just has a theory and we're all, affirming each other and our theories. And then it's like we have 50,000 different theories and none of them mean anything because none of them have been rigorously tested by trying to punch each other down, all right? But that's the only way we can sort of figure out whether or not these theories stand up to scrutiny, all right? If you take it in like a very extreme example, like imagine astrology, right? Imagine that my theory for how the world works is based on astrology and whatever your zodiac sign is, you're a Pisces, you're a Sagittarius, whatever. I just write papers. I'm like, oh, personality is based on people's zodiac signs. And people are like, oh, that's so great. And oh, I find a Pisces person over here and this is their attitude. And I found a Libra over here and that's their attitude. And I found a Cancer and a Virgo and nobody ever challenges me. People understand that that's ridiculous, right? Instead, people should be trying to find personality conflicts with like nonsense zodiac sign astrology, knocking my theory down and say, Josh, your theory doesn't stand up to scrutiny, right? And then all of a sudden we get rid of astrology, right? Thank God. Okay. All right. So that's what research should be about. Okay. Now, theories change when research disproves a theory, and this is starts off with finding what's called an anomaly. So an anomaly is something that doesn't fit into your theory. So you find an example and you're like, well, this example right here doesn't fit into your existing theory. Can you explain that? And people are like, I can't really explain that with my theory. Then your theory is a bad theory, right? And you need to either readjust your theory, you need to do more explanations, testing, whatever of your theory. And eventually, if you get so many different anomalies that keep coming in and disproving your theory, then eventually you're like, all right, you know what? I just have a bad theory, right? So again, let's take astrology. Let's say like you said a Pisces had this type of personality. I found all of these people who are Pisces who don't have that type of personality. These are a lot of anomalies to my theory. And it's like, okay, maybe this whole astrology thing and what I said Pisces were, maybe it's just all garbage, all right? So yeah, I have to readjust my theory and say, okay, I don't think the month you were born in and your zodiac sign has anything to do with your personality, right? So if you find enough anomalies that don't conform to your theory, eventually you have to say, okay, maybe it's not the data, maybe my theory was just bad, all right? And that's a hard thing to do for academics, right? It's like I spent 10 years in college trying to get a PhD, and then maybe I spent 10 years trying to work out a theory that included publishing papers and going to conferences and teaching this stuff in my class. And then eventually, you know, like I'm 50 years old, I've dedicated my entire career to this one theory, and someone comes in and is like, your theory's wrong. That's a hard thing for people to do. All right. We've talked about this with regard to cognitive dissonance, right? And doomsday cults, right? People get sucked into doomsday cults forever because when they're presented evidence that they were wrong about, you know, when the end of the world is, they have a hard time. It's not that they have a hard time accepting the evidence. It's that they have a hard time also realizing, like, I disowned my family. I gave away all my possessions. I gave all my money to this cult leader. Now that they realize, like, holy crap, I wasted 20 years of my life on something that isn't true, right? And the same thing can happen with academics. So there's this sort of like saying or this idea in academics that theories like start to change once like the old guard starts to die off. Like that's when you get new theories in academics, is when enough people who sort of created the original theory die off, and then they're not there to defend the new theories coming up anymore. Because again, you have a lot of people who are old, like older people in academia, and I'm going to be this guy one day, right? So I'm not disparaging old people in academia, but they spend their entire life defending a theory, and then these new people come in and they're like, we're finding holes in your theory, and they rigorously want to defend it because it's hard to reconcile that they might have been pushing false studies or understandings or theories for a lot of their career, right? But that's the nature of academia. The nature of academia is like we're all going to get stuff wrong, have some humility, realize that new evidence is going to come in and sort of completely blow up this theory you're working on. And I'm sorry that it, you know, wasted 10 years of your life or 50 years of your career, but that's just the nature of academia. All right. Okay. Again, if your theory or hypothesis is correct, it will hold up to rigorous testing. So give people your theory, allow them to use your theory as a punching bag, and if it's still there, it's like, okay, cool, it's a good theory. All right, so now, quick case study. All right, so there is a, they're back in the 1980s, a little bit into the early 90s, there was this friction between these two Harvard law professors, all right? So this gentleman at the bottom, his name is Derek Bell. He passed away a few years ago. This gentleman up here, his name is Randall Kennedy. He is still around. I believe he's still teaching at Harvard. I don't know if he is retired or semi-retired. He's been at Harvard for like 30 years though, right? Harvard Law School, all right? So in the 1980s, these two got into some friction with regard to Derek Bell's new theory called critical race theory, which you've probably heard about somewhere in the news in the last year. Some of this stuff was coming up with like the BLM protests last summer, all right? So Derek Bell and some others started to create a structure for this new legal theory. It starts in legal studies. This new legal theory called critical race theory, right? So this gets into conversations about things like when we say like systemic racism, like it's pervasive through culture, right? When people say there's a book called Racism Without Racist. So this idea that like racism, it's just sort of pervasive, like white people aren't overtly racist anymore, but it's just like race has been so built into the system that discrimination against non-white people is just going to happen, right? So this is what critical race theory was positing, right? Is that even if like white people aren't overtly racist anymore and there aren't sort of laws on the book that are overtly racist, racial discrimination is still going to manifest, okay? So this gets into things like implicit bias and systemic racism, and when people talk about like legacies of like slavery, Jim Crow, critical race theory is sort of built on these ideas, all right? So this is Derek Bell. He's one of the, I think like he's like the guy, and then there's a few other people who sort of join him very quickly. But if you were to say like there's one person who sort of put it out there, it would start with Derek Bell. Okay. So they're writing in the 1980s, Derek Bell and other critical race theorists. Randall Kennedy comes into Harvard as like the young whippersnapper of, and I believe he wrote this piece in, I believe it was 1988. All right. But he looks at some of the tenets of critical race theory and he says, I'm going to try to disprove it, right? Because this is what good research does. You take a new theory and you critique the crap out of it, right? And if at the end of the day, again, that theory holds up to scrutiny, it's like it's a good theory. But that's what Randall Kennedy was doing. He was reading a lot of literature from this new thing called critical race theory. And he's like, I'm going to poke a bunch of holes in this because I don't think it's a solid, sound theory yet. So in 1988, he ends up publishing this piece in the Harvard Law Review. All right. So again, these are two heavyweight fighters, right? Harvard Law duking it out in Harvard Law Review, right? So this isn't the minor leagues. Like this is big time stuff. All right. And he writes this article called Racial Critiques of Legal Academia. And this is available in a PDF. I'll put the PDF link down below. You can get it online. I've probably read Kennedy's piece 10 times over the years. It's really good. It pokes a lot of holes in critical race theory. He brings up a lot of really good questions. Kennedy isn't, I mean, he's obviously like he's a young black professor in the 1980s at the time this is written. Like he's not ignorant of the fact that like racism was legally allowed, 25 years prior to him getting to Harvard, like 1960s, right? In the 1960s, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, it's like this stuff was happening, in his early life. Like he's not unaware of racism in America, right? But he does say like there's a lot of holes in the ways in which racism in America, specifically in the legal system, is being explained through critical race theory. So he punches a lot of holes in it, right? And the way that academia should work is Derek Bell should publish a paper and say, here is critical race theory. And then Randall Kennedy should come in and say, hey, I'm an outsider. I have a lot of questions, all right? I'm going to poke a lot of holes in your theory, and I'm going to write a paper about it. And then what should happen is Derek Bell should come back with another paper. And Derek Bell should say, hey, Kennedy, I saw all your critiques. Here's the way that I'm going to answer all your questions. And then Derek Bell should shoot back and answer a bunch of Kennedy's questions and maybe poke some holes in some of the questions that Kennedy has. And then Kennedy says, okay, now I have a new crop of questions that I'm going to ask because, I think that some of your questions are insufficient. Or excuse me, some of your answers are insufficient to my questions. So what academic does at its best is the person who creates the theory, they are the ones that need to defend the theory. All right? So everybody else is allowed to ask questions, or at least they should be. It is Derek Bell's responsibility to answer the questions that Kennedy is asking. All right? However, this is not what happened. Okay? What ends up happening instead, prior to, and Derek Bell wrote this up in an article, right? So this is Derek Bell's words right here. Like he doesn't shy away from it, right? Which I think is very anti-intellectual of him to do, right? What he says is that when Derek Bell, read when Derek Bell read Randall Kennedy's anti-critical race theory manuscript, Derek Bell urged Kennedy not to publish it, both because he thought his criticism of CRT was inaccurate and unfair, and this is the important part, because there were a legion of white law teachers who did not like and felt threatened by our writings about CRT. So Derek Bell is saying to Randall Kennedy, don't publish this. I think it's bad, right? So you shouldn't publish it because it's bad, which isn't an excuse not to publish it. Again, if somebody publishes something that's bad, the best response is for you to write a follow-up article and tell them why their article is bad, right? But regardless of that, Derek Bell is telling Randall Kennedy, don't publish this because there's a lot of white law professors out there who don't like CRT, and they're going to grasp onto Randall Kennedy as like token black scholar that we can all sort of glob onto and say like, look, even a black guy doesn't like CRT, right? Derek Bell is saying, don't publish this, not because it's not true, not because your questions aren't valid, but because it might cause some waves to happen with CRT, right? CRT is new and it's fragile, and if you start poking holes in it, a lot of people are going to dismiss critical race theory, right? So Derek Bell is like, don't publish stuff because, like, don't throw us under the bus, don't air dirty laundry, right? And Randall Kennedy, obviously, looks at all this, and Randall Kennedy says, no, I'm going to publish it. He ends up publishing it again in the Harvard Law Review 1988. It's called Racial Critiques in Legal Academia. And you can read it down below, so you don't have to trust my summary. But some of the things, I'll give you a brief summary, but you can read it on your own, so you don't have to trust my summary of it. But what Randall Kennedy is saying is, one is that there's a lot of holes in this idea that there is sort of de facto segregation in the legal system as well as in law schools. So, for instance, like you can't, when critical race theory sort of talks about groups, Randall Kennedy is saying like you can't talk about people in groups because there are exceptions, right? So when Derek Bell and others are making the claim that non-white scholars are excluded from legal academia, Randall Kennedy's like, you can't just say it sort of overgeneralize that way, because he's like, I'm Randall Kennedy and you're Derek Bell and we're both black and we're at Harvard. So obviously there are ways in which non-white scholars are allowed in Ivy League legal institutions, right? So Randall Kennedy just thought that Derek Bell was overgeneralizing the sort of like exclusive all white boy club of the Ivy Leagues as far as law schools and professors were concerned. So Randall Kennedy was like, you just don't overgeneralize. Like there's a lot of ways in which, and Randall Kennedy, I mean, I've definitely seen interviews with him lately. I mean, he would say to this day, like, yeah, there's definitely racial problems in the United States, and they are sort of institutionalized, and we need to remedy them. Randall Kennedy is definitely sort of like left of center, empathetic to racial issues, and he's spoken very publicly about it and has written about these issues. But he's concerned that Derek Bell is sort of exaggerating the problem with regard to ideas of like essentialism. You can't, like what Randall Kennedy's critique is like, you can't just say that, these difficult situations are happening to all black people. You have to sort of parse it out and just be very nuanced with your discussion. Randall Kennedy's also saying one of Derek Bell's critiques of like legal studies, for instance, is that Derek Bell thinks that there are certain classes that white professors should not teach or be involved in if they have specifically to do with sort of like racial issues, hate crime legislation, etc. And Randall Kennedy's like, you can't just say like all white professors don't understand these issues. All right, you can't go in there and say, black people understand all of these things and white people understand all these things, and neither will their paths ever cross with regard to understanding these legal issues. Randall Kennedy's not having that. He's like, that's ridiculous to say, like, basically what he's saying is like, all white people think the same and they're all exactly, and all black people are the same and they all think the same. And Randall Kennedy's like, that's not, you can't overgeneralize like that. Like, we have to be more nuanced and careful in these discussions. And Randall Kennedy gets into some specific examples, right? So you have like Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. It's like, this is a black man sitting on the Supreme Court. He's definitely more conservative he's a conservative justice on the Supreme Court. So obviously he doesn't sort of fit into the mold of what Derek Bell would say, like all black people sort of see the law in this way kind of attitude. So there you have it. All right. So read the critique from Derek Bell. But again, it's sort of in this like fight, this friction, academic fight, right? This friction. I think that Randall Kennedy kind of wins as far as he doesn't win the debate, but I think he sort of wins with regard to how do you proceed through academia, right? If you have a theory It's your job to defend the theory. And if someone comes in and questions it, you don't look at them and say, don't publish your paper. You say, okay, publish your paper. And then if I really strongly believe in my theory, I'm going to critique the crap out of your paper and tell you all the ways that you're wrong, right? Like that's how you fight in academia. That's what academia should be. Okay, let's move on. You should engage in the Socratic method, right? So if you propose something, I get to ask you questions, lots of questions, right? So Derek Bell proposes something, Randall Kennedy is like, cool, I get to ask you a million questions. And that's the Socratic method that we're engaged in, right? It is on you to satisfy my curiosities if I have questions about the conclusions that you are making or the statements that you are making with regard to if you think your theory is, hot stuff, okay? So that's the Socratic method. Should always be on the person who is making the claim to defend the claim, right? So this goes with things like critical race theory. It goes with a whole host of things, right? You can get into question again. You can go back to like astrology. If I'm a person who believes in astrology and wants to propose we all study astrology in class, like you all get to ask me like, hey Josh, I have a million questions about this, right? If I'm the supposed expert on astrology, you as the students get to keep raising your hand and asking me lots of questions about and poke holes in my argument. It's not on you to defend my beliefs, right, or my conclusions any more than it's not on Randall Kennedy just to sort of bow down to Derek Bell and say, okay, I guess that's your theory, I'll just ignore. No, like Derek Bell has a theory, critical race theory, and it's on him to keep answering questions for people who are sort of outside the critical race theorist circle. Just kind of, if they keep raising their hand and asking questions, like you're the one who came up with this theory, like answer my questions. All right. So it's always on the person who is proposing the conclusion to satisfy outsiders' curiosity, right? So if anybody ever tells you or anybody else, like, just put your hand down, just listen. No, that's garbage, right? And for any and all theories, right? This is opposed to dogma. So I used to have I had some professors, not all my professors, either in undergrad or graduate school. And the first day of class, they would come in and they would say things like, let's just assume, such and such exists and it's true and this is the way that the world operates. And we're just going to sort of work from that perspective for this in the next 16 weeks. And my thing was always like, well, what if I don't believe that, the tenets you're laying out are true? Or maybe I do believe them, but I want a deeper explanation for it. The student should be allowed to raise their hand and say, look, I have a lot of questions about these things you're asking me to believe. So you are going to need to explain these things to me. Like I'm a novice, like I don't know what these things are. So go ahead and explain them to me. Like you should have to explain it to me, right? You don't just get to tell me what abstractions are fact. Now they might be fact, right? So let me give you an example of like a classroom situation. So if you're in like a gender comm classroom and the professor says, look, like first day of class, we're going to come in and let's say the class is, half male, half female. And we're going to come in on the first day and we're in a gender comm class and we're going to talk about, differences with regard to the sexes. And we're going to talk about, issues in the world with regard to discrimination and sexism in the workplace and in academia and all this other kind of stuff, right? And it's like, okay, this is the conversations we're going to have for the next 16 weeks. Cool. The first day of class, the professor comes in and says, look, like, let's just assume that, sexism exists and we all agree that sexism is real and, it is manifesting itself in this classroom right now and, patriarchy exists. And so we're just going to kind of move through the class with this understanding. So, this is going to set the tone with regard to how students are interacting across, male and female differences, right? If I'm a freshman, right, and I might have heard the word sexism before, but I've never experienced whether, I'm a male or a female student, right? And I don't really understand how it exists in the classroom. I should be allowed to raise my hand and say, I'm sorry, professor, like, I don't think sexism is currently existing in this classroom. Like, what are you talking about? Can you explain this to me? Can you tell me how and why? Like, we need to just be mindful of sexism in the classroom when, like, this is day one and, I haven't seen sexism on this campus yet. I haven't experienced sexism in my life. If it's a female student, maybe a male student says, like, I've never perpetuated sexism before. Like, it might be true that sexism is manifest in the world, right? But again, It's on the professor to explain that to the students, right? And that's important for a couple reasons. Number one, it's important because that claim may or may not be true, right? But more importantly, it's important to explain it to the students because the students should have an understanding of the facts behind the claim, right? So if a professor just goes around and is like, these things are true, and they don't fully explain it, the student is completely unprepared for answering those questions, for him or herself, right? So now the student just goes out into the world and they're like, hey, did you know sexism is pervasive on our campus? And someone's like, yeah, tell me why, tell me how. And the student's like, I don't know, I just heard it from a professor, right? Like, no, the professor should be equipping the student with some sort of tangible explanation and evidence and facts in order to explain that sort of ideology or that point of view or that worldview or that conclusion or what have you, right? So anytime a professor just says like, this is a fact, and you disagree with it, or maybe you're just confused about it, you're like, I don't understand how this is a fact, you should be allowed to raise your hand in the classroom and say, I have a lot of questions about this, I don't see how this is a fact, and please explain it to me, give me some evidence for it, so that one, we can test your theory, but two, like I can have a better explanation of how this actually works, right? So again, we go back to the Derek Bell, Randall Kennedy situation. It's a lot of what Randall Kennedy was doing. And if you read the article, again, I'll put it down here in the notes. That's what Randall Kennedy's doing. He's like, here's all these questions I have, and you need to explain them to me because I can't figure out the answer. And maybe you, Derek Bell, maybe you have the answers, right? And so give me the answer so that I can better understand what critical race theory is right now, because right now it seems like a lot of over-exaggerated, over-generalized claims that sort of like essentialize and categorize large groups of people, and there's no nuance involved. So you need to explain this to me in detail in a follow-up critical race theory paper and answer my questions. And I mean, unfortunately, in that situation, Randall Kennedy was largely dismissed by a lot of scholars in the CRT community. His questions never got answered. People basically looked at his paper and were like, you're not one of us. They kicked him out of the club, and they're like, we're not even going to acknowledge that these questions exist because we don't want to even acknowledge that you exist, because they would say things like, you're just being provocative to be provocative. So Derek Bell's questions from 1988 have never been answered by anybody in the CRT community because they just sort of dismissed them outright and said, we're not even going to pay attention to your questions. And I think that that's largely nonsense. All right. I think that they should pay attention to his questions. I think these are good questions. And I think anybody who spent, 30 plus years at Harvard Law School is, sound enough and intelligent enough to ask extremely important questions that, deserve answers, right? Again, he's not some like kook on Twitter, being provocative behind an avatar. It's like, is a pretty important, pretty important person in sort of American academic life who has questions, and they ought to be answered. All right, relate your findings to previous research, right? You can verify, you can always offer more support for your previous findings. And again, you might not know what extra support you need because a theory is so obvious to you. It's like you need outsiders to ask you questions, because those outsiders might ask you questions. You're like, oh, I hadn't even thought about offering evidence for that yet. So there are theories. So Derek Bell might have said, look, critical race theory is so manifestly obvious that I shouldn't have to state all these details of it. If an outsider comes in and is like, I need some details because it's not obvious to me, Derek Bell should have come in and said, okay, let me explain this in detail now, right? So you can constantly sort of keep backing up your theory with more and more evidence to support your claims. And sometimes you need outside people to tell you like, hey, I think your theory is bullcrap. Because that gives you an opportunity to sort of dig deeper down into the details of your own theory to say, okay, to me, it seems very self-evident with regard to my theory, but I can understand how other people don't see it because they haven't been studying it as long as I have, right? If I'm Derek Bell, I am immersed in critical race theory stuff. I am immersed in conversations about race in the legal system in the United States for the last 250 years. Like, he is at Harvard Law. Like, he knows the law inside and out, specifically as it pertains to racial discrimination laws and Jim Crow and, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. He knows this stuff, right? If I'm an undergrad in his class or a first year law student, it's like I'm not going to be as well versed. So for him, it's so obvious, but he needs to kind of keep offering that evidence. All right. You can elaborate on previous findings. You can call out bad research and findings, right? And this is why you cite sources, right? So you cannot engage in scholarly conversations unless you listen to other scholars. Okay. If you only listen to non-scholar sources, Huffington Post, Fox News, MSNBC, right? You're not acting in a scholarly way, you're acting as a journalist. Now, this isn't to degrade journalists, right? But this is one of the reasons why I ask students not to cite things from like the New York Times or Fox News or MSNBC or whatever. It has nothing to do with journalism or bias or anything like that. It just has to do with the fact that you have decided to engage in this scholarly endeavor called academia. So those are the people you should be talking about. Journalists talk to other journalists, all right? But as far as like the sort of professional setting that you're in, the professional setting you're in is in an academic one. So you should be talking to other people who are doing academic work and are sort of speaking the same language and who are engaged in the same type of literature that you are also engaged with, right? If you're an English major, it's like you should be reading all of, you should be reading all of, Shakespeare, right? You should be reading, Jane Eyre, like you should be reading Dickens, right? And all the other people around you are going to read that same stuff, and then you all are going to have a conversation about it, right? You're an academic, talk to other academics. That's where the conversations happen, all right? And you do that, through citing sources. All right, when you write up your scholarship, you think, what are your findings? So, the end in your conclusion. It's like, were my findings expected? Did I have a hypothesis that went in this direction? Were there any findings that were surprises to me? It's like, oh, I had this idea and it would totally turned out to be wrong. So that was a surprise. And are there any contradictions? So are there findings that just seem like they don't mesh together? And then you say, maybe I need to do another study because these two puzzle pieces aren't fitting together. All right. So you do follow-up studies. All right. This is really where a lot of Randall Kennedy's concerns came in with the early stuff with regard to critical race theory in the 1980s, is Randall Kennedy would say, look, there's all these contradictions here with regard to how race is manifesting specifically in legal studies, right? So you say, so Derek Bell was saying things like non-white individuals were sort of like not allowed into these institutions of higher learning that had weight in the legal community. And he's sort of saying there's this broad generalization. And then Randall Kennedy was like, I'm Randall Kennedy and I'm black and I'm at Harvard, and you're Derek Bell and you're black and you're at Harvard. That seems to be a contradiction. Like, you need to be more nuanced in this, right? Now, there might be ways as far as like positions of power. Like, is there a dean, right? Is like the law school dean, has it only been a white guy forever? Like, okay, that's the question, right? If we sort of break it down proportionally, right? If black individuals make up about 13-14%, I believe, of the U.S. population, is that representative in law schools? And maybe law schools throughout the entire United States, maybe it's only like 2%. And it's like, okay, well, that's, 2% is not good. Like, it, should be at least proportional, like 13-14%. However, like 2% isn't 0%. And so, like, let's just be very nuanced and be exact and precise in our numbers and what we actually mean with regard to sort of navigating these contradictions. All right. Applying your findings. So suggest practical use for the findings. So for instance, if you do a study that says people are stressed and therefore, TV is an escape. So you apply the findings and you say, okay, maybe people should watch more TV to relieve stress. All right. So this could happen in your conclusions. What are your prescriptions based on the conclusions that you found? So you might do a study with regard to students being sad. And you do some sort of, you create some sort of stimulus about calling their parents or doing meditation and doing yoga and working out. You apply all these stimulus to students who are sad, and you say, oh, I found a high correlation of students who are sad. We gave them multiple stimulus, and the best stimulus was calling their parents. And so in the conclusion, I say, hey, look, if you want to be a happier student, you should call your parents more. All right. You can do the same thing with like exercise studies. It's like, students are really stressed out and sad and depressed in college because of, and so we tracked students and we found out that students who exercised more got happier. And so my prescription is like, make sure you exercise, once a day for 30 minutes or whatever it is, right? apply your findings in the conclusions. Tell people what they can do with the results that you have presented, right? What's the practical application? All right, be humble. Mentioned this a lot, right? We've talked about this line from the movie Theory of Everything, but it's based on the biography of Stephen Hawking's life, where he has this quote in the movie where he says, what one believes is irrelevant in physics. Again, everybody has their beliefs, but you have to test your beliefs, right? Beliefs are not what in academic terms are known as heuristics, right? It's like a shortcut. It's like, I'm going to do this thing because I think it's true. It feels like it's true, right? Everybody has these shorthands known as heuristics, right? But your beliefs are irrelevant. Like you should go out and test it, right? So in this regard, Stephen Hawking in this film is talking about whether or not God exists. And somebody questioned it, it's like, oh, like I thought you found this out and you believe that God exists now. And Stephen Hawking's like, what I believe about God is irrelevant. It's like whether or not we can test it and like whether or not we can, mathematically prove it. How did the universe work? Was there a Big Bang? Was there not a Big Bang? Like that's what Stephen Hawking is sort of getting at in this scene, where it's like, my beliefs about God are irrelevant to me. It's just, what does the math bear out? Like that's what's important. What do the numbers bear out? All right. Be truthful about what your research does and what it does not do. So again, sometimes researchers, they overgeneralize because they want their findings to be important. People exaggerate, right? People exaggerate in academics, people exaggerate in their dating life, people exaggerate with regard to like their athletic abilities. It's like everybody kind of fudges here and there. But you can't do that in academia, right? So again, if you do a study on college students, but everybody in your sample is from Brandywine's campus, you can't say that these findings apply to all college students. It's like you can say that they apply to Brandywine students, all right? And that's it. So don't overgeneralize. We talked about this in the last video. This is some of the problem with sort of like mainstream cable news these days, or just mainstream media in general, is that most media is located in a couple major cities, but then they act as if the issues addressed in these major cities are somehow a stand-in for what the rest of the country is doing, right? And you can't do that, right? You can say like, okay, these are problems in like New York, right? They're in Atlanta, where CNN is located, Los Angeles, maybe Chicago, right? But you can't say like this is a problem in America. It's like, no, like everybody on this panel right now lives in New York City. You are probably overgeneralized. Like it might be a problem in New York City, but you can't overgeneralize and say it's a problem throughout the United States. All right. So okay, if we go back to like the sexism example, right? You might find like some sexism exists, right? Like sexism does exist, right? There are awful people out there who do awful, horrible, disgusting, sexist things, right? But if you do a study on it, you have to be careful to say like, did I find a few people who did awful things, or is sexism systemic? Oops, did not mean to erase that. This happened to be a bad color, right? So did you find systemic sexism, or did you just find some awful people who did some sexist things? So this is one of the things that we have to be careful about, when we're talking about our findings. All right, so you don't want to sort of be overbroad. And I mean, I think this would also apply to the Randall Kennedy, Derek Bell situation, where Randall Kennedy is very open about it to this day, where he's like, look, yeah, racism exists, right? He's like, I'm a black man who was born in the late 50s, early 60s, I think, right? So like he's very aware that racism exists, but he sort of draws the line at like whether or not it's systemic, whether or not it's pervasive. He says, yeah, racism exists and we should address it, but let's not go so far overboard that we're overgeneralizing, because if we overgeneralize, we're not actually going to solve the problem. You want to make sure that you properly diagnose the problem if you actually want to address the problem. And so there you have it. All right. So Randall Kennedy is kind of always sort of trying to figure out where the line is between bad people who do racist things and whether or not it's systemically racist. And that means that the entire society or culture or institution of Harvard where he's at, like, does it all need to be overhauled, or should the couple of people who did something that is racist on Harvard's campus, should we just, expel them or suspend them or put them through some sort of sensitivity training, or like that's what Randall Kennedy has done multiple times throughout his career at Harvard, where he's constantly trying to figure out, not figure, but he's constantly sort of pushing these questions when people say, look, there's a huge race problem. Randall Kennedy is like, okay, there was a racial incident. Was it an incident with a couple bad people, or is it really this big systemic problem? And that becomes important with regard to how we address the problem. If it's systemic, then the whole institution has to be overturned. If it's a couple bad people, punish the bad people, but we don't have to completely throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't have to completely overhaul, Harvard as an institution. All right. So you want to be careful with that. And yeah, I mean, as you probably can tell through this PowerPoint, like I really like Randall Kennedy. He does a great job. He's just a very nuanced, thoughtful person who is completely aware of the problems in society and culture, has written a lot about racial issues, but he does so in a way that is nuanced and complicated. And it's not, anytime people overgeneralize, it just feels like cable news shows, right? It's like two people arguing and they just like make these big, huge, outlandish claims. And you're like, I kind of want to know the details of it. Can we dig into this? Can we have a nuanced conversation for a couple hours to really parse this out? And that's how Randall Kennedy, that's how he is. He speaks in a way that is nuanced and thoughtful and gets to complicated things and ask really interesting questions. So read some of his books, maybe Google him, look up some YouTube videos of him, and listen to him talk about these issues. I think you're going to learn a lot more than just turning on MSNBC and someone just saying like racism exists. It's like, okay, like now let's get past that and let's get into the details. Randall Kennedy gets into the details. All right. Can you generalize your findings? To what extent do my findings relate to everyone, or do they just relate to college students? Do they just relate to Brandywine students? Do they only relate to freshmen at Brandywine? We talked about population stuff in the last PowerPoint, so just make sure you're not overgeneralizing. The end. All right. Based on the findings and limitations, then you suggest future research. So this is for your conclusion. Future research is, okay, now that I did this study, what questions still remain? All right. Are there new questions that have come up? Maybe I need to broaden my sample size. So maybe I did do a study on Brandywine's campus that talked about the smoking habits of students. And now I want to broaden my sample size to all of college students in Delaware County or all the college students in Pennsylvania, because now I have new questions about, are smoking habits different on a small campus versus, University Park, Penn State, which is like a bigger campus. So maybe I have new questions about smoking habits. Do students who commute, do they smoke more than students who are who live on campus, right? So there's some new interesting questions about smoking habits in college students that I might have that have been generated from the previous study, all right? So I might want to change the demographics a little bit. I might want to ask you different questions, all right? So that's what limitations are. Limitations, I just want to reiterate this because it's on the test. Limitations are things that your study did not answer. What are the limits of your study? And based on the limits of your study, you can go back and say, you know what, one of the problems with my study was I only asked Brandywine students, which means that I only asked college students on a small campus. That's a limitation. So in order to sort of correct that in a future study, I want to broaden it out to all of Penn State University students. So this is going to include University Park. So now we're going to talk about students on a small campus and students on a big campus. So your limitations are, what are the parameters of your study? And now your future research is like, okay, I want to go a little bit further now and figure out how to bring more people into more demographics into my study so that I can more generalized future studies. All right, and finally, all right, so there's this quote from the textbook on page 395, right, that says, research means going out into the unknown with the hope of finding something new to bring home. If you know in advance what you're going to do or you're going to find there, then it is not research at all, right? So again, this goes back to like day one stuff. It's like, why are you doing this research? If you already know what your conclusions are going to be, you don't have to do the research. If you go into research trying to prove your theory, you're not really doing research with that attitude. You should go into research trying to disprove a theory that you've dreamed up because you're trying to find new and creative ways of supporting your theory, right? if you're a person who's if we go take the Derek Bell example, if you're a person who says I'm a critical race theorist, and I'm just going to go find a whole lot of examples where racism is manifesting in the world, you're not really doing research because you already know that your conclusion is, oh look, like racism exists, right? You should go out and say like, can I find ways in which there are holes in my theory? Can I find new ways? Are there new explanations for these phenomenon that we see in the world with regard to racial disparities, which do exist, right? Are there other explanations for this? But if you get so committed to a theory that you already know the conclusion of your paper before the paper is already written, then you're not actually doing research because you wrote the conclusion first. You shouldn't be writing the conclusion first. You shouldn't say, and look, my theory is further supported. That should not be the first sentence of your paper. What you should do is say, look, I have a theory in mind. I'm going to throw a lot of interesting questions at it. I'm going to look for new variables. I hope to find something new or a new variable that might challenge my ideas. That's what research is. Now, you might find out that you get through the paper and it's like, wow, my theory was pretty good, right? That's a happy accident. But if you go in already know that every time I write this paper, I'm going to find a conclusion that says I'm awesome and my theories are correct and my hypotheses are always correct, that's not research. That's just you being dogmatic. So like caveat for myself is I don't trust academics who have been in academia for at least 10 years or so, who have never changed their mind about a certain theory or an idea. All right, I just don't trust them, and the reason I don't trust them is because my assumption for those individuals is that they are only conducting research in a way to further validate the beliefs they already have. Every academic should have at least a handful of theories or ideas that they have changed their mind about over the course of their career. Because that means they're doing good research. That means that they're honest. That means that they're humble in their approach. Nobody knows all the answers to all of their research questions for the next 50 years. Nobody knows all the answers when they're a 28-year-old freshly minted PhD. If you're still thinking that the same theories that you sort of stumbled upon when you're 28-year-old freshman or 28-year-old newly minted PhD, if those stay the same for the next 50 years of your career, you're like, you have a dumb career. Like, why are you just like, you're just gonna like, you found nothing new in 50 years of your career, you're still thinking the same things you thought when you were 28. That's absurd. All right. So I don't really trust those people. I do trust people who say like, look, like when I was 28, this is what I thought. And then, 5 years later, I changed my mind because I came across new, or 5 years later, I refined the theory. So maybe you don't have to go like 180 degrees and totally flip your ideas, but you can at least say like, oh, I found some new nuanced ways to understand this theory. I used to think this about the theory. I still subscribe to the theory, but like my ideas have changed a little bit and I found some new and creative things. Like you just shouldn't have the same ideas, 50 years later that you had when you were 28 years old and just got your PhD, all right? If you aren't doing new things and challenging existing research, then research just becomes an echo chamber. And all an echo chamber means is that a bunch of academics who have an idea, they just keep saying very nice things to each other. This was if we go back and we'll conclude with Randall Kennedy once more. I mean, this was part of the problem with some of the stuff that was going on in Randall Kennedy's situation is that he was an outsider, and there's a small, and he lists important names in his document. So if you read Randall Kennedy's paper, he goes through, he's like, here's important critical race theorists, and they're, he's like, this is the work they're doing, and part of his thing is like, but all of them only cite each other's work. And all of them are only talking to each other. And Randall Kennedy's like, I'm an outsider and I have questions. But the problem is that all these people who are currently in the 1980s doing critical race theory, they're just talking to each other and they all agree with the same thing. So they just created this echo chamber where it's like, yeah, this theory is great. And the other person's like, yeah, your theory is great. And like, oh, your explanation is great. And everybody's great, 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 great. And Randall Kennedy's like, I have questions. And they're like, stay out of here. Like, you can't come in to our little echo chamber and we're all just going to keep repeating the same ideas over and over again. And Randall Kennedy's like, I have a different idea. I have a new idea. I have a different explanation. I want to challenge your theory a little bit, right? And again, he's not doing it in a malicious way. He's doing it in a way that says, I'm a new law professor here and I have a lot of questions. And what should have happened is that these individuals should have allowed Kennedy into this little circle so that it's not an echo chamber. So they have dissenting voices, or they have different perspectives, right? If you're just hanging out with people who all agree with you, none of you are learning anything new. Nobody's being challenged to progress their theory or to make their theory better. All that happens is like CRT, the only thing that could happen is like if they don't allow Randall Kennedy in 1988 to enter into their little club, then their theory is going to be stagnant. And their theory is not going to grow, and it's not going to change, and it's not going to sort of get refined into a solid theory if you only stick around people who never challenge your theory. And so your theory is just kind of stuck in 1988, right? And so that's one of the things that you always want to do is if you have some new things to add to the conversation, you should be challenging theories so that you can refine your theory, so you can make your theory better, so you can answer questions. Otherwise, it becomes an echo chamber. And echo chambers are bad because all that ends up happening is the people who are allowed to talk about the theory, right? Randall Kennedy's not allowed to talk about it, right? The people who are allowed, they're just going to say like, yeah, our theory is great. And they all just keep echoing each other's, greatness about all these ideas. And there's never any challenges. So the theory can't grow. And theories need to grow, and theories need to change, and theories need to be refined so they have solid foundation below them. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of people saying, yes, 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 this theory is great. And it's just sort of like built on, it's built on sand. All right. So you have a theory, throw a lot of punches at the theory, try to knock the theory down, allow people to critique your theory. And if the theory is still standing at the end of all of that contentious debate, your theory is awesome. All right. So engage in the debates, welcome people who want to debate you. Challenge people who, you're not sure about their theories yet. Do it in a respectful manner, be humble about it, recognize like you might be wrong about your theories, they might be wrong. Like that's academics at its best. All right. Okay. That's it for the class. I will see you all, for your presentations.